Once upon a time, there was a stubborn child who never did what his mother told him to do. The dear Lord, therefore, did not look kindly upon him and let him become sick. No doctor could cure him, and in a short time he lay on his deathbed. After he was lowered into his grave and covered over with earth, one of his little arms suddenly emerged and reached up into the air. They pushed it back down and covered the earth with fresh earth, but that did not help. The little arm kept popping out, so the child's mother had to go to the grave herself and smack the little arm with a switch. After she had done that, the arm withdrew, and then, for the first time, the child had peace beneath the earth. This is the No Fear Podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is Season 4, Episode 2, and we are diving into the dark world of the fairy tale. We are diving into the very dark world of the fairy tale because I think Matt just scarred me for life reading our intro, which is a Grimm's fairy tale called The Stubborn Child. Now, most of you know Grimm's fairy tales. They are probably the most famous version today of fairy tales. Of course, fairy tales go back much, much longer than the Grimm era. And of course, most of us know the more Disney-fied version of those Grimm's fairy tales. But there are a lot of fairy tales out there that are probably lesser known, and The Stubborn Child is one of this. So I just want to take a moment to unpack what we just read, if you don't mind. Because when Mel, you were the one who suggested we use this for our intro. Mm-hmm. And I, because things have been crazy around the house, did not have much time to really do a lot of reading before this episode. So I hadn't read The Stubborn Child before Matt read it, and my jaw dropped as he was reading it, because it is, first of all, it's very short. It's only a paragraph, and it's about a child who essentially gets sick, fatally gets sick, because he was disobedient. So we are, I guess, living in a world where that is the price for being disobedient as a child, is you're going to get sick and die.
Yeah, the dear Lord will do it to you, apparently.
Yeah, because the Lord let him become sick. But I don't even know what to do with the end section of the little arms poking out of the earth. Because are we to believe that even in death, he's just still a disobedient, stubborn child? Or is this one of the earlier zombies in literature? Because we did not go back this far when we did our zombie series.
Well, I think, too, part of, and this could be, it could be a translation thing, but the phrasing of the last sentence where the mother goes to the grave and smacks his arm with a switch, and then it says that, after she had done that, the arm withdrew, and then for the first time, the child had peace beneath the earth, as if not just that he was disobedient, but that he was not at rest until he had been smacked with a switch and punished for his disobedience. And again, that could be a translation thing there, but if we use the phrase "the child had peace beneath the earth," then that's just for me that adds another level of disturbing there, that he was not at peace until his mother had smacked his hand with a switch.
Yeah, and the fact that the way I found this, the way I stumbled upon this, is I was reading this 2012 article in the New Yorker called "Once Upon a Time, The Lure of the Fairy Tale" by Joan Acasella. And some of her questions I had as well. She asks at one point in the article, was he buried alive? Because there's no clear he died. It just says no doctor could cure him. In a short time, he lay on his deathbed. After he was lowered in the grave and covered over with earth, his arm pops out. So she's like, was being buried alive part of his punishment? Is it, like you guys are saying, that he's still acting out even though he's dead? So he has to be whipped. I mean, there's just so many disturbing things going on here. The writer of the article even quotes A.S. Byatt as saying, A.S. Byatt wrote several books, including Possession, but A.S. Byatt wrote, "This story doesn't feel like a warning to naughty infants. It feels like a glimpse of the dreadful side of the nature of things." And I kind of agree. It's almost like there's another level of meaning to this about, like, the culture, like the way children are looked at, but also maybe I'm thinking this could have even been written in a time when, like, this child would get ill, and this is a way to explain that, like it's a fact that the child was ill and died, but this is a way to explain it. He must have been acting out and deserved punishment. But, like, no matter how you look at it, it's still disturbing and shocking.
Well, and it is. And a lot of these stories were cautionary tales, which I'm sure we will get into that aspect of the fairy tale before this episode is over. But when I look at this, I wonder, kind of like you did, Mel, who this is a cautionary tale for. Because it does seem at first reading that, well, this is for naughty children. And this is a story, because it's so short, that you could just whip out at any moment and, okay, don't be like this, kid. You don't want to get sick and die, do you? But it also seems to be one for the mother as well, because the child doesn't rest until she brings out the switch and essentially punishes the child, which is, I think, why I thought, is this kid still acting out even in death? And that's why he found peace. And that is maybe a warning, or at least a little bit of instruction for mothers out there who would have been the ones also reading these stories. Because the Grimms did write, I think you mentioned this, Mel, one of their collections was actually called Household Tales. And so the mothers would have been reading this, and maybe it was some sort of parenting instruction for them too. It's kind of like, okay, kids are going to act a little naughty, and it's your job to bring out the switch and give them peace and kind of set order straight. Which kind of goes with some biblical instructions too. Because I feel like, and I'm bad about pulling up where in the Bible things came from. I'm bad at playing that game. But I do remember a few verses that, kind of fall along the lines of spare the rod, spoil the child. Mm-hmm. And there's one that's something along the lines of, if you bring up your children, the gist of it is, if you bring up your children with the Lord's teaching, and if you bring them up with discipline, that they will give you peace. Which kind of reminds me of, like, the dark funhouse version of that. Of, you're going to have a disobedient child if you don't discipline them in the right way. I don't know if that involves burying them alive or just swatting their little zombie hands as they come up from the earth.
Maybe if she'd used the switch when he was alive, he wouldn't be a little zombie hand in the earth.
Well, see, that's kind of what I'm thinking. Is that this is probably more of a cautionary tale for the parents out there than even the child. Because whose fault is it really if you have a child who is so disobedient that the Lord is like, well, you know what, we can let this one die. I mean, we're probably not talking about just childish pranks.
Well, and I think it's also if you're thinking of Grimm's fairy tales, I'm no expert in Grimm's fairy tales. I read fairy tales when I was a child. I had one of those record players, where you'd read the book and it would ding when you turn the page. Somebody's reading the book to you on the record. And I vividly remember the pictures from Rapunzel and Little Red Riding Hood. And I was rereading and reading some fairy tales I'd never read before to get ready for this episode. And a lot of times, the women in the fairy tales who are doing these sorts of things to children, I know this might be a cautionary tale about disciplinary action, but there's a lot of witches and stepmothers who are doing kind of violent things to children. So it's interesting that this one is specifically like, this is a mother maybe like doing this out of love, like you're saying, Lisa. Like if she had done more of this in a loving manner when he was alive, this wouldn't have happened. And, apparently, and I think it's in this article, actually, the New Yorker, they talked about how the Grimms actually changed some of the mothers in the tales that they were hearing and writing down to stepmothers because they didn't want to talk about mothers doing disturbing things to children. It wasn't like building up the national character they were looking to build up. So I'm wondering if this is one of those stories where they thought, well, this is something to tell mothers, like they should be doing this, and then we'll have better children. I'm trying in 2019 to understand what they were thinking in 1812 or whatever.
Well, I think that's definitely something that we're butting up against is this idea, like our modern conceptions, the 2019 conceptions of parenting and childhood and child raising. And I mean, I think even at that time period, like children were basically just considered little adults. And so, part of the idea of punishing them as severely was because, well, I mean, if an adult acted that way, you'd really punish them, right? And so, yeah, like I definitely think child raising and just general psychology has evolved quite a bit since then. But it's, for our sensibilities, yeah, really, I mean, it's completely foreign to me, this whole thing of beating your child obedient from beyond the grave.
Yeah, it's just interesting in that language of the story that they said the mother had to come back and do that because other people were the ones at the grave trying to keep the little arm from flailing up through the dirt. And I don't know, when I read that, I was just like, well, yeah, they had to go get her because she was the only one who could really do it.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like an act of love in a way at that point.
Yeah.
To just make it stop, kind of.
Yeah.
As they can.
I
think you should pull this out as a warning to one of your children, Lisa, and tell us if it works.
I think I'm gonna have to pass on that one. But what I will do is give you just a little bit, because we've been talking about the Grimm's brothers. So I thought I'm just going to give you a really quick kind of history of what we talk about, what we mean when we talk about fairy tale, and then talk about the Grimm's a little bit, because I have found a few more of their really twisted fairy tales that kind of go along with this. So that, I don't know, because this one is not an anomaly. Like they were some twisted fellows, which I'm interested in what you said, Mel, that they actually changed some of the stories to be mothers to stepmothers because they couldn't imagine a parent actually doing some of these things. So they knew what they were writing was horrific at times, which is interesting. But first, we should go ahead and say that when we talk about a fairy tale, we were first talking about really those oral tales that people told each other. So the ones that were probably linked to some sort of cultural or religious group, and that were spread among people, usually to entertain, but also to teach and instruct. A lot of these have a strong kind of moralistic tone to them. They're trying to teach the moral of the story. But people who have studied these kind of tales see that they go back possibly, we're talking 5,000, 6,000 years. So these epic tales that would be told, we would probably classify as fairy tales. Now, that New Yorker article, Mel, that you were referencing, mentions that there are two real varieties of fairy tales. The first one is that oral tradition that cultures share. And I say that because, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, but, you take a very familiar fairy tale like Cinderella. And there are lots of different cultures around the world that have a similar story of a young girl, kind of rags to riches, marries a prince. She's very virtuous. She has people who are being mean to her and her family, that sort of thing. And so that transcends different cultural boundaries. So a lot of these stories share at least a core essence. But then you have the stories like we're talking about here, and these are the published stories of like the Grimm brothers or E.T.A. Hoffmann, Hans Christian Andersen, who of course gave us The Little Mermaid, Charles Perrault, the French kind of version of the Grimm's fairy tales. And the Grimm's brothers, Wilhelm and Jacob, were writing in the first half of the 1800s. And they were brothers. They were actually brothers. And they collaborated on a lot of their writing. In fact, I loved this little fact here, is that for most of their lives, they worked in the same room at facing desks. I just find that adorable. But they wrote a lot of these stories that they had heard. And of course, this is the time of like German Romanticism. And so there was a lot of dark things going on anytime you dig into that. But I'm going to tell you just a few of their kind of unique stories. I will tell you the Cinderella one first, since that's the one we are probably most familiar with. Have y'all read this Cinderella that the Grimms wrote?
If I have, it's been a long time.
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
good.
It's the very violent one, correct?
Yes. So there is a Cinderella who has an evil stepmother and two horrible stepsisters who make her lives just absolutely miserable. I think her name was Aschenputtel. I think that was her name
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
And she has a fairy godmother. Although in the story, it's the fairy godmother and the dead mother are kind of the same person, and they're embodied in a magical tree. And the tree will like shake down the stuff she needs. And she's also friends with birds, who help her with things. And so they help get her ready for the ball. And she does meet the prince, and she does fall in love, and she does leave her shoe behind. Although, and this is what most people, if you've read the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, this is what they remember, because I love this. When the prince goes around with the shoe to see the maiden whose foot fits into it, he comes across his stepsisters, and they are so desperate to raise their status and to marry the prince and to get their own happily ever after, that when their big feet will not fit in, they decide, well, that's no problem. And so when the prince is not looking, they hack off their own toes and heels. So they manage to shove their now mutilated feet into the shoe. And it's only when they are halfway to the castle that the prince realizes there is a blood trail behind them. And now this happens twice, because she's got two stepsisters. So he falls for this trick twice. That he takes them back and is like, you're not the one I want. And then finally finds Cinderella and takes her back. And, she does get her happily ever after ending. At the wedding, though, those little bird friends who I mentioned at the beginning of the story, they return. And they're so mad at how the stepsisters have acted that they then peck out their eyes. And that is their punishment for being so evil, is that they have to live blind for the rest of their life. So.
Well, that's horrifying.
And that's not even the worst of them. I just like that one because most of us, when we think of fairy tales, I feel like Cinderella is the first thing that pops into my mind when I talk about it, or when I think about it.
Well, now's probably a good time, because I had wanted to bring this up, this idea that we use the word fairy tale, I think, very magically and very happy these days. We talk about the fairy tale romance and a fairy tale wedding and all of these sorts of things. But I mean, if you're familiar at all with like the mythological fairies, especially like in England, they're not like they're not Tinkerbell. They're mischievous, like spiteful things that you leave presents out for so they don't like curse you, essentially. And so I think, you know, people feel like there's this disconnect when they hear about the original Grimm's fairy tales versus the Disney versions, but I mean that's right on par with just a fairy in general, at least in the original conception before Tinkerbell and all those sorts of things. So, you know, the hacking your feet off to fit them into a shoe and then having the birds peck your eyes out. And is it Snow White where the evil queen has to dance herself to death on a bed of coals or something like that? That's one of them. You know, those are,
yeah.
I mean, that's right up in line with like what happens when you cross a fairy. Like they'll bless you if they like you and they will curse you if they don't. So you just want to stay on their good side, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the Snow White one, the Grimms did write a version of that. In fact, there was Snow White and then Rose Red. And they were, oh gosh, it's been a while since I read it. I want to say maybe they were sisters or the stories were often told together. But yes, the evil queen is forced to wear these red hot shoes, which those dancing shoes, they show up in several different ones. But yeah, you're made to dance until you die, kind of, which now I just got a wonderful image in my head of Hocus Pocus. In the scene where they're all forced to dance until they die, but of course it's a Disney movie, so they're saved. Yeah, you're right. We do use that term fairy tale. And Matt, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because when somebody says they want a fairy tale wedding, you have to question really what that means. Because I feel like Hallmark movies are like based on this, right?
Well, they certainly don't mean that they want a bunch of impish little sprites to come and be fickle around them. You know?
Right. Well, and these stories are very, they are very dark and disturbing. Even the ones that have, you know, sort of happy endings, but not all of them do. We mentioned Hans Christian Andersen and The Little Mermaid. And in that version, you know, it's the same thing. The Little Mermaid, she's not Ariel in that. In that version, but she gives up her, you know, her voice. She trades it for legs so that she can woo the prince, except he doesn't fall in love with her. And she turns to sea foam at the end of the story. It's a very tragic story. Similarly, Rapunzel, and this is the Grimm's fairy tale version of Rapunzel. You have the princess locked in a tower who has the long hair. But basically she ends up, when the prince goes and finds her and they fall in love, and the mother finds out, of course she cuts off the hair and sends her out of the tower and basically tells her she can't come back. She gives birth to twins. That also happens in the Cinderella Sleeping Beauty version too. That's how Sleeping Beauty actually wakes up, is when she gives birth to twins and they start to suckle at her.
Yeah, that ending to Rapunzel kind of surprised me, because I remembered as a kid being disturbed by the fact that the prince was thrown out of the tower and blinded by the thorns. But I had never read that second edition where he finds Rapunzel with their twins. I was like, whoa. And apparently in the first edition, their conjugal visits in the tower were kind of described. Because the first edition of the Grimm's Tales was apparently intended for adults. They just wanted to entertain adults. And they had that kind of dark aspect of romanticism to them. But then they were like, oh, we could sell books more geared to children and maybe make a little bit of money. And so readers were like, ooh, some of the stuff is a little too dark. But the interesting thing, in the New Yorker article talks about how they left a lot of the violence in, but they took some of the information about sex out. So it's like Rapunzel magically has twins at the end, but there's no explanation like how, unless you know. But if you're a kid, you don't have all the description of the prince and Rapunzel's relationship. So yeah, I don't know. It's kind of interesting how in each edition they were, you know, as all writers do, changing and revising things based on the audience that they thought that they had at the time.
Well, and that is interesting because, and again, the disclaimer that we cannot understand the culture that these were written in through 2019 lenses. But what must it say about them that, because you're right, the Grimm brothers, they wanted to make money writing and they had a plan. It wasn't just that they wrote these stories down, for the fun of it. They had a greater business plan. But when they did decide to market it towards children, that they did decide that the violence was okay. And not the sex. And I don't know, that's really interesting to me.
Oh, you think about Little Red Riding Hood. I remember being a kid and listening to that story, and the wolf literally is eating people, and they're chopping up the wolf and pulling people out. And I mean, it's really intense. And so, or The Robber Bridegroom, which in the edition that I read, the girl is promised to this man who lives in the woods. Turns out he's a leader of a bunch of thieves and seduces women so they can chop them into pieces and eat them. And it literally shows them chopping this girl. The girl who's presently betrothed to him goes there to visit him. An old woman hides her, and she witnesses them kidnap a girl and chop her up and eat her. And she takes the girl's finger to her father as proof that the guy is going to eat her. And I'm just like, whoa. I mean, just cannibalism, all sorts of violent stuff are in these stories. And I mean, I guess they're interesting warnings, I guess, to a certain extent. And they have that romantic ideal of like the dark woods and who knows what's going on there. But really intense, for family stories.
Wasn't there a Grimm's fairy tale? And I'm not sure if this was one that was geared towards adults or children, but that basically was how the children butchered each other.
Oh, I don't know. It sounds like it could be.
It was something like that.
There's what the children in the time of famine, where the children just lay down and die so that their mother will survive the famine. Maybe it's a similar theme to that.
It was, but it was one of these where they were playing. I'm not making this up, I promise. They were playing, and one was pretending to be a butcher, and one was pretending to be a pig. And then the boy playing the butcher, like actually slaughters the pig, the other little boy. I
would not be surprised. Oh, here it is. I use Google.
You are brave to Google that.
How some children played at slaughtering.
That is it.
It was removed from the book in the second edition, so that the second edition that was geared toward adults and children, apparently, according to Wikipedia, that was the first thing that popped up.
So that was an adults only story. Okay.
According to this, yeah. Let me see. I'll Google this more later. But yeah, apparently one of the first lines is "You be the little pig and I'll be the butcher," which is really disturbing.
Look, they were talented. I mean, the Grimm's brothers, one of the reasons that they endured for so long is because they knew how to tell a story. And I find that interesting that is when we really see, I think with them and that kind of era of the fairy tale as literature or the fairy tale as entertainment, we see it change. Because I think when it was more entrenched in the oral tradition, it was more of a moral story than it became. Because when I was looking up some of these, and I know I mentioned it at the beginning, of what different Cinderella stories exist around the world, or what we can kind of recognize as the same type of story, a lot of them had to do with, making sure, like teaching girls that you needed to be kind, you needed to be humble, because you usually had a young kind of Cinderella character who grew up to be wealthy and have success, whether that meant marrying a prince, or in some stories she actually got the wealth herself. But she almost always either had a sister or a stepsister who was the polar opposite and like was disobedient and was haughty or vain, which I find really interesting. That does tend to speak to let's teach our daughters how to act. Let's tell them these stories and kind of teach them that if you want if you want to be successful, this is how you have to behave. And
yeah, I think so. And I'm thinking of two things right now. And one is that even the harsh ones, I can kind of understand how they might. I mean, if you're living in a very difficult time period and you think of children as little adults and they're growing up in this really difficult world where there's famines and disease, you think of the oral culture that the Grimms would have been pulling from. Really harsh, horrible things are going to happen, and you don't do children any favors by not letting them deal with reality in their own time. And there's a lot of children's stories even today that have some disturbing things to them, with abandonment and violence. The other thing I was thinking about too is I'm wondering if some of the fairy tale becomes much more. I haven't done the research on this to say for sure, but I'm wondering if like the cult of the child and the idea of the child as having toys and having a long childhood and not kind of being a little adult might have changed some of these stories a little bit, and led to maybe a little bit more of that magical idea that we think of rather than the harsh kind of violent warnings that we would have had from, say, pre-19th century stories. But that's just me kind of thinking about literature and spitballing there, with that last point.
Well, we're going to have to, I mean, and I'll just go ahead and say that this episode, generally when we do new series and we start tackling a new subject, the first episode is just meant to kind of be an overview or maybe a history of what we're talking about. And we'll kind of tackle like why something is scary or what the history behind that is and how it got used for horror. And so I'll just go ahead and say with this idea of the fairy tale, we're not going to be able to be comprehensive in the history of it just because, well, it is so extensive. It does go back so long ago. But also because just the notion of a fairy tale has changed so much that it becomes hard to pinpoint, well, what is a fairy tale and what's not. And you're right, Mel, in saying that it has shifted so much. I mean, we've talked about it. We've talked about how we use the word fairy tale in a vernacular to mean something, much different than what an actual fairy tale is. And we kind of have the joke of, well, what is a fairy tale? Well, it begins with once upon a time and ends with they lived happily ever after. And we're just going to assume that some either horrible stuff happens in between those words or some really adventurous stuff happens in between those words, depending on the type of story you're telling. But we've talked a little bit about Grimm, and we've mentioned a few of the other people who turned these into stories that were meant for a literary audience, more so than just oral stories being told. But I feel like we're going to have to address Disney at some point. Because if we're talking about what makes a fairy tale, and they may be the reason that we do use the word fairy tale the way we do today. I cannot tell you how many, like, for instance, we said Matt, I think you were the one who said fairy tale wedding. I mean, even look at like the ball gown that brides will often wear. I mean, there are so many weddings that I've been to that almost kind of mimic that ending wedding at the end of Disney's Cinderella, the animated one, where you have the bride in the big white dress and the horse-drawn carriage and the sparkly shoes. you know? So I feel like we have to talk about this a little bit. And I've mentioned this before, but Disney is one of my other obsessions other than horror. um, and so I've watched a lot of it, and even it has changed its idea of what a fairy tale is and what it presents to audiences. Because when you look at its very first fairy tales, and it pulls most of them from the Grimms. So we'll take Snow White, for instance. That was a rather dark movie. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of us remember it as being, there's Snow White and there's the 7 dwarves, and she lives in the tiny little house with them, and they mine for jewels, and she cooks and cleans for them, and at night they have dance parties, and that's it. And there's an evil queen. And that seems to be what we remember. Well, recently I watched it, and of course I watched it as an adult when I had memories of it as a child, but I hadn't seen it in a while. And I really saw how frightening and dark that movie was. And even though Disney cleaned it up a lot from the Grimm's version, the queen certainly didn't have to put on red hot shoes and dance until she died. But just some of the things I found. Number one, I had almost completely forgotten about the huntsman, and that the huntsman was sent to not just kill Snow White, but bring back her heart in a box. I watched this with my kids, and that was a lot for them to kind of take in. They were like, I remember my 6-year-old going, I'm sorry, what's the box for? Like, he just kind of had this moment of what did she just ask him to do? And the huntsman, and this is what I really didn't remember until I rewatched it, but the huntsman, he says, oh, I can't do it. Don't make me kill her. Because basically he's like, don't make me kill an innocent child, because that's what Snow White is. Don't make me go murder this innocent child and then cut out her heart, because that sounds horrifying. And he basically does it not because he's the villain or because he's mean, but he does it because he's so afraid of the evil queen is so evil that whatever she will do to him or his family is so inconceivably bad that he would rather go kill a child and cut out the heart. And that was in the Disney version. You know what I mean? Like that was horrifying. And then, not even to mention, and again, I had forgotten this, when Snow White runs away and she runs into the woods, there's a rather nightmarish scene in the woods where things are like transforming, and like the trees transform into, their limbs transform into like claws basically and start grabbing at her, and everything has angry eyes. And I think it's meant to show, how terrifying the deep dark woods is, but it is a legitimately scary sequence in the film. And I was again shocked, because I thought I was showing my kids, I'm glad they watched it, but I was like, oh, we're used to watching things like Moana or Frozen, which is one of their favorite ones right now. And this was so much darker and scarier than I had anticipated. But I did have that thought, Mel, kind of circling back to what you were saying, is that sometimes I think part of why we show them things like this, or we tell them the scary stories, is to prepare them for scary things that are going to happen later. Because isn't that one of the functions of horror as, a literature form, is to not only be cathartic, but to allow us to experience something scary in a safe place so that we may be more prepared for it when it comes. I may be reaching there and talking about Disney Snow White in that way way. But I think especially when you talk about maybe why the violence was left in some of those Grimm stories that were meant for children, or some of the illnesses that resulted in death, or children who just were experiencing kind of horrible things, not sex, but other things. And maybe that was meant to be a little bit of that. Well, let's give them a very small dose of the scary stuff in the world and see how they handle it before we push harsh reality on them. Let's show it to them in an entertaining way so that they can kind of laugh. But we're really trying to, I don't know, almost kind of inoculate them against some of the really horrific stuff that life may throw at them later in life. I don't know. Do you think I'm really off base with that?
No, I don't. Though my memories of when I saw Snow White when I was a kid are very different from yours, because I remember the trying to cut out her heart and put it in a box, and it terrified me. So I don't know what that says about me, that I focused on that as a kid and remembered it. But
I legitimately only really remembered Dopey, and I remember him putting the diamonds in his eyes and making that like a funny face. That was, I don't know, that was my memory of it. I had these like joyous memories of, oh, this is such a fun movie. And then before you even get to the Seven Dwarfs, it's like, oh my gosh.
This is not a fun movie.
This is horrifying.
But no, I agree with you that these stories might be more like warnings. I do think it's an interesting choice that the Grimms made to maybe shield children from the sex of the stories rather than the violence. But like you said, like if you're living in a time period where you have all these challenges, and it's not necessarily that an evil queen is watching you in a mirror and going to chop your heart out, but people may have, it's not all stepmothers are evil, but people may have a stepmother that you have family dynamics when you have step parents sometimes, or mothers might die in childbirth and the child has to grow up without a parent, or illness may come through a town and children could pass away. Or there may be a band of thieves living in the woods next to your house. Or if you think of the story, The Goose Girl, which I was disturbed by this last weekend, where a servant takes over the position of a princess in her life through kind of like switching identities with them, and has a talking horse that can rat her out beheaded, but it still talks, because the evidence is going to come out at some point. They may seem overblown to a certain extent, in like these fictional stories with all these like witches and whatever in them. But I think in the different time periods when we tell these types of stories, just like you said about horror, there's a kernel of something in them that we should be aware of or empowered about. One of the articles that I looked at, came from Literary Hub, and it was by Amber Sparks, and she talked about the useful dangers in fairy tales for girls reading them, and women, and this idea of like telling stories to young women to help them be prepared. It doesn't do any good to tell girls in our world, unfortunately. The Charles Perrault and the Disney Cinderella sometimes you have to tell a little bit of a darker story so that when you get into the world and terrible things are happening, you're not completely like taken off guard. And I think there is something to that as like a warning or a way to teach. Yes, we still need we still need the positive stories too, and the stories of like empowerment. We don't want to, as the writer says in Lit Hub, we don't want to like traumatize people, but at the same time, I think we also want to look at life clearly. And sometimes you can tell a parable or a story and teach something more easily than just telling someone a true story about something that happened down the street or you saw on the news. And I think that idea of storytelling is never going to go away. No matter how far into the 21st century we survive, I don't think that aspect will go away.
I think that's a really good point. And I think because I have thoughts on that, Mel, that may be a good point to kind of wrap up this episode on, because we are going to start to see how the fairy tale shifts and changes. And of course, anybody who's with me on Loving Disney and some of the women in Disney will see that even though they do keep it positive, the female characters have started to become a bit more empowered. And I don't think that's just because of the changing times. I think there's a lot to do with because we mentioned, some of these writers writing in the 1800s who were writing fairy tales for a mass audience. And we saw we will see a resurgence in that of different writers, specifically women, who have kind of taken on the fairy tale and adapted it and used it to teach something, like you said, Mel, even maintaining that really kind of dark element of it. You might even say horror element of it. And using it to get their own messages and their own lessons through. So I will just leave it there, and we'll kind of dangle that carrot. And as we develop this series a little bit more, I'm sure we will talk about how some writers, and specifically some horror writers, are taking this fairy tale and doing really interesting things with it. So I'm really excited to continue this idea. And I don't know, I hope our listeners will follow along over the next couple of episodes as we explore this topic a little bit more. Before we end, speaking of books and writing, I just wanted to remind you guys that Mel and I did write a book. It is called Monster, She Wrote, and it is a nonfiction book about the women writers who defied convention to craft some of literature's strangest tales. So it's about women who basically built up the horror and the speculative fiction genres. And that book is going to be released September 17th. So it's really coming up. If you're listening to this before the 17th, you can pre-order the book now by going on the Quirk Books website or through any major book retailers. We're really excited about it. And as we are getting closer, as the date approaches, that the book is coming out, Mel and I are actually going to be traveling a little bit to help promote it. So we wanted to let our listeners know kind of first, so that if you're near any of these places, you can come see us and say hi, because we would love that. So the first one is September 17th. We're going to be in Nashville at the bookshop. And we would absolutely love for you to come to that. That's going to be the book launch. That's following Sunday. We are going to be actually in Collierville at the Barnes & Noble doing a signing. That's right outside of Memphis. So if you're in that area, any Tennessee people. There are a few more dates that we're not quite sure of yet, but one that we do know in October, getting kind of into the spooky Halloween season. If you are near Salem, Massachusetts, we are going to be at Salem Horror Fest on October 14th. So anyway, we are very excited about that. We would love to say hi and talk to some No Fear Cast listeners. So if you're in any of those areas, please consider coming. If you are not, that is okay, because we'd still love to hear from you too. So just as a reminder, we're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, you can send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. And if you just love what we're doing, you can consider supporting us on Patreon, and you get exclusive content when you support us on Patreon. So you will get basically weekly episodes, and you'll get to hear episodes that our regular listeners don't get to hear. So if you want that content, that is on Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, if maybe you can't support us monetarily, that is absolutely fine, because it is completely free if you tell a friend about us and help spread the word. Or even better, consider rating and reviewing us, because that does help us by helping other listeners like you find our podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode talking about fairy tales.